Welcome to St. Paul. I'm Pastor Clark. It's good to be with you. We're going to do some Bible study today. In Matthew 13, we have been, this is the third week in a row where we've been walking through Matthew 13 and parables that Jesus told. We've been kind of hopping around and skipping things. And this week we kind of fill in the blanks of everything we skipped. So in earlier days, when we talked about the parable of the sower, we skipped from that parable across parables to Jesus' explanation. And then we went to another parable, the parable of the weeds and the wheat. We did the similar thing. We skipped over the parables in between, and we went to Jesus' explanation kind of at the end of the day. And here we go back and read the parables that were in between all of that skipping around. So that I think over the course of these 3 weeks, we get the whole continuous teaching, Jesus' parables from Matthew in Matthew 13. But here we fill in some gaps. So maybe a question to wonder about is what, how do these parables work in relationship to the other ones that we heard? Because that's for Jesus, it's one continuous teaching. These parables are, maybe we could say coming at the same thing from different angles or with different metaphors. So yeah, as we read through, let's keep awake and aware to that. Here's what I'm awake to and aware of today. Stepping back and looking at the whole context of the Gospel of Matthew starts out with a confrontation between Herod, who wants to kill Jesus and maintain his control and power, and God, who first of all makes Jesus's birth possible and then protects Jesus and his family. Throughout the gospel, there will be a similar dynamic in terms of we see a picture of the leaders, both the political and the religious leaders, being about death. They seek to bring about Jesus's death, and Jesus points out the ways that their leadership causes suffering, causes harm, causes death. This, on the other hand, set next to Jesus, Jesus' own life and ministry. Jesus is about life. Jesus is about healing, reducing harm, creating community. Where they destroyed, Jesus heals and rebuilds. So that's the kind of two sides of the coin of the gospel. Is this setting the scene of the world, the leaders, both religious and political, and the deadly consequences of their leadership, and on the other hand, the like living, healing consequences of the love of God that is made known in Jesus Christ. So on the one hand, it's death. On the other hand, it's life, love on Jesus' side, and a kind of a need for control or jealousy or greed. I mean, there's a lot of ways you could probably describe the flip side of love. But that's the overall picture. And that, stop and think about that in terms of what the living Spirit of Jesus in our own time and place wants us to see about the world that we live in. It's sort of, here's kind of how I take it, that, as a father, thankfully we're beyond these times, but, when the kids were smaller, there were things we had to teach them were dangerous. Don't put your hand on the stove because it's hot. Those kinds of things. Otherwise, the kids will get burnt. Otherwise, then there's a deeper tragedy of continually getting burnt and never knowing why. never knowing how to protect oneself and to navigate the dangers. And then you're just in this loop of continually being harmed and continually being confused about the source of that harm. That is part of Jesus's teaching, although it's not about the dangers in a kitchen, it's about the dangers in the world. And the awakening that Jesus is helping to bring is probably not one that's unfamiliar to a lot of the people who follow him, but the sources of danger being the very leaders, both political and religious, that are shaping the world. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees, Jesus says at one point. What does that mean for us in our world? What is Jesus hoping we see about us in our world? Parables are just another way that Jesus tried to wake people up to reality, to the dangers, and also to the great love of God and the presence of Jesus and the power of the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is Jesus calls it in Matthew. It's unique to Matthew, the kingdom of heaven. In other gospels, it's the kingdom of God, Luke and Mark. And in John doesn't really speak in that language at all, the Gospel of John. So here is parables. Here are a series of parables, two of which we've already heard, that Jesus goes into. The disciples ask questions about them, and so Jesus goes into more detail about it. Those two parables. Here is a series of, how many we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and sort of a sixth. 5 that are about the kingdom of heaven, and a sixth that is what it means to be a teacher of Jesus's way, or of the wisdom that these parables seek to embody. And before we dive into them, and even more like another kind of context setting thing, this is just about my own, where I'm coming from. I really resonate with this quote from Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. She says, "Love and justice are not two. Without inner change, there can be no outer change. Without collective change, no change matters." I find the wisdom in these words represented in the words of these parables. I mean, in so much of Jesus's teaching. But even if we would stop and kind of unpack what kingdom of heaven, I mean, the fact that kingdom is kind of a quaint word these days. I mean, where do we hear that word except in fantasies and fairy tales? We don't live in a kingdom. But what if it said something more like the government of heaven? There's a way in which this phrase of Jesus is meant to hold both the inner and the outer realities, both the our souls, which are ourselves, our bodies, which are places of God's contact with this world, a place that is heaven within us, is our soul. I mean, that's the mystics, great mystics have talked that way, especially Teresa of Avila talks about our soul being heaven. God's heaven is our souls. So there's that inner reality that's held by a phrase like the kingdom of heaven. But there's also an outer reality that talks about the systems and structures of our world. You know, a kingdom is a system of government. There is a network of relationships and a set of power dynamics that the word kingdom really represents. It's a very earthly word. And so Jesus puts a very earthly political word together with literally the word heaven in the Gospel of Matthew. And so how I understand that kingdom of heaven is that there are outer systems and structures that nurture inner awakenings. There's a spirituality that both within ourselves that resonates with a spirituality of the way we order our society politically, religiously, our institutions, etc. What I understand Jesus doing is awakening us both to the potential of our inner realities and the spirituality of the outer realities, and helping us bring into alignment, leading us in bringing into alignment within our own souls and in the world and its politics and leaders and religious institutions, to bring all those into alignment with God and the kingdom of heaven, which is an inner and an outer reality. The very word religion, religio, ligament, those are I've got ligaments in my elbows and in my knees. Have you ever had a knee surgery? Maybe it's been to repair the ligaments that help hold your bones together in a way that allows your body to move. So religio means reconnect. And those are two things that many people of faith, many Christians pull apart, the inner and the outer. Love, which is kind of a personal, private kind of a way of thinking, and justice, which is an external way, how public, how our society is ordered, how our politics and institutions work, right? Love and justice are not two. I hear some of that wisdom in these parables, and I hear Jesus bringing those together and talking about kind of there's suffering is wrapped up in all of this, and the necessity or inevitability, perhaps is a better word, the inevitability of suffering. Suffering is part of the process of waking up. When we recognize suffering in ourselves and others, that's a beginning of an awakening. And not an awakening to despair, but an awakening to the great love of God. And it even as we are awake, seeing the way the world is, the world as it is versus the world as God intends it to be, there is suffering there, Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. There's the blessing that Jesus is talking about, while even recognizing the tension of being awake and seeing a world that's asleep and causing so much harm. Being awake to the possibility of love and healing and justice, while the rest of the world is sleeping on it and is in so much pain and causing so much pain. So that was a little Sermon on the Mount there. Okay, so, this may seem like a long digression from these parables, but I think it's really important to put them in the context that the gospel puts them in, the context of Jesus's life and ministry and death and resurrection, and also to just give you a sense of where I'm coming from when I look at them. What are some of the traditions that influence me as I come to this? So, with all of that, let's dive in. So Jesus put before them is crowds. Jesus is teaching crowds here, crowds of people, not just his, very committed inner circle of disciples and leaders in training, but also the hangers-on, the curious, those who are moving toward deeper commitment to Jesus, those who may never. The crowd contains multitudes. So Jesus put before the crowds another parable, The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in a field. It is the smallest of the seeds, but when it has grown, it becomes the greatest of the shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. All right. I think this parable just perfectly encapsulates this union of inner and outer, of love and justice, of the inner change and the collective change. Okay? Because, you think of a mustard seed, which is the smallest and seemingly most insignificant thing, and then it's sowed in a field. So it literally becomes, it's not visible anymore. This thing that's already so insignificant disappears. What if Jesus is talking about the soul, the individual person and their kind of connection and awakening with God, their sense of this part of the kingdom of heaven, which is the inner life, which is rejuvenated and healed as we come to see ourselves in God more and more and see God's presence dwelling within us. There's the mustard seed, right? Buried in the field. When it's grown, it becomes the greatest of the shrubs and becomes a tree. So that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Like this, there is a phrasing here that refers back to the prophets and to Isaiah that uses a tree, specifically a cedar tree, as a representation of a nation, as a metaphor for this great collective, which we call a nation, that has a leader and a history and a culture that binds it together. It's about the collective. And so Jesus is doing a couple of things here. One is he's kind of connecting the inner and the outer. The seed sowed in the field, which I'm receiving as the part of the kingdom of heaven that's about the inner awakening to the presence of God in our own selves and bodies. And this outer reality, this metaphor of a tree, which is about a nation, it's about the collective, okay? Those two things go together, Jesus is saying pretty clearly. Jesus is also then twisting this metaphor of a tree a little bit, because anybody who knows mustard and the shrub knows that it is not the majestic cedar tree that was spoken about earlier in the Bible that the prophet was talking about. It doesn't have the same stature. Literally, it's not as tall. But part of what Jesus is saying is that this is the kind of a nation, the kind of a collective that really gives rest, that really can provide home, safety, belonging, shelter for people, is the kind that grows out of souls that are awakened, grows out of individual people who are awakened. So it's the resonance of the outer and the inner. That's what I hear in this parable of the mustard seed. All right, so Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. Very short, just one sentence of a parable. Jesus, again, giving us metaphors, mini stories maybe, of what the kingdom of heaven is like. And again, it has that, this picks up the last parable, the smallness of the yeast and being mixed in. That it actually doesn't take a lot of yeast to leaven a whole loaf. The loaf, that could also stand in for a sense of the external, and how even a small number of people at work with these transformed sense and this awakened soul. It makes the whole loaf, the whole nation, the whole collective, just raises it, literally. Okay, kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. On finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. These two obviously go together. The two before go together, and then these two about the treasure in the field and the pearl of great price. So we've got little pairs of parables. Now these two, I don't know, maybe you see some of that connection of that union of the inner and the outer, the individual and the collective. I don't know if I do. In these two particular parables, I don't need to squash everything into that paradigm. But I think it does talk about the search. You know, that it certainly describes, I think, the inner journey, what it really is like. And in the first one, there's like an accident to it. That is, in the second one, there's an intention, right? In the second one about the pearl, there's a merchant who's looking for fine pearls. That's like their intention in life. And then they find one. So like, this resonates with those who seek shall find, teaching that Jesus gives at another point. In the first parable, there's no sense that this person was actually out there looking for treasure. They just stumble upon it, apparently. But they treasure it when they find it. And so I think that's probably true both in our inner journey and our collective journey as well. But that both of these, it happens, we find, we awaken to the great value of the kingdom, of the love and the justice, both accidentally and because of an intention that we've set or a commitment we've made. That both of those are true. They're kind of opposite, but they're both true. So, there's just another reason why, we churchy people ought not think of ourselves more highly than the non-churchy people, because they, we might think we're the intentional ones, and they're the, like whatevers, but like they can stumble upon it just as much as we can, There you go. Take that for what you think it's worth. Might not sell everything for it, but okay. So here, these last two don't necessarily fit into a pair like the ones before. So we'll take them one at a time. And they're, at least this next one is a little longer. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and caught fish of every kind. When it was full, they drew it ashore, sat down, and put the good into baskets and threw out the bad. So it will be, so we both get a parable and an explanation of the parable. So 47 and 48 verses 47, 48, that's the actual parable. And then Jesus kind of steps back from the parable in 49 and 50 and explains it. Okay, so, and the explanation is this. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous, the evil from the just. That word that's translated righteous can also means justice. There's not that separation in the real meaning. So the righteous, the just, same difference. Those who seek and do justice. Okay, so the angels will separate the evil from the just, throw the evil into the furnace of fire where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. this, but this kind of connects with the other parable that we heard just last week of the weeds and the wheat. It connects with a parable, a kind of a parable, the mini story that Jesus tells about the sheep and the goats. There's this sense of separating, of sorting. And the point that Jesus made in the weeds and the wheat is that it's not up to us to judge. That's God's job. It's the angels who will do the separating in this little parable here. That's not our job. So leave it to God. But the other part, we talked a little bit about the inevitability of suffering, and here I think it gets clear. It's just like it's either wake up to the suffering now or later, and honestly, the way that I understand what the life to come will be like is that it's deeply connected with what of life in the life before, if that's the life after. That what Jesus invites us on is an awakening to both the great suffering within and around us and the deep healing, loving, justice making presence of God within and around us. And then a pursuit of doing that love and justice, being that love and justice, so that there's just like the leaven, that there is a raising. The whole loaf is raised by that focus of being that, doing that love and justice. And so if we're in that, if we've been on that journey of awakening in this life, then the next life will be just the awakening will be less painful and more joyful, because we've done some of the painful work here and now, and we've been practicing both giving and receiving the love and the justice now, so that there will be less pain to need to experience then later, and more joy and love and justice to give and receive then. But if we're not on that path, if we haven't awakened, not on that journey of awakening here and now, all the more painful it will be when we awaken then. And it will just be a harder thing to receive all of the love and belonging and justice later, in the life to come. And, you might even look at this is kind of off the tact of Matthew, but of Paul, Saul, who becomes Paul, Saul, who's persecuting the church and literally doing violence, presiding over the stoning of Stephen. He has an awakening. And that is first a judgment, God's judgment of, why are you persecuting me? And then an invitation to serve the great love and justice of God, known in Jesus. But that same awakening, it's kind of like, do it now or do it later. Do it now and get it over with, is almost a very simplistic way that I understand the connection of this life and the next, so that the next life can be a great, joyful receiving. I think that great, joyful receiving is going to be present for everyone as we are all purified. But there's that now or later kind of presence is also in the Beatitudes, where Jesus said, blessed are those who weep and mourn now, for they will laugh and celebrate. And woe to those who right now, laugh and celebrate and make merry, because they will mourn. There's so much of what creates the injustice and the lack of love in this life are is when we try to divide love and suffering, try to pull apart joy and death, life and death, as if they were separate. And so I get all the life and everybody else gets the death. And Jesus is trying to say, hey, you got it all comes together, and you can't avoid it. There's no avoiding the suffering, but just trust. Not even, for Jesus himself, even though in his early days as an infant, he by the providence of God and the protection of God, survived while the other infants were massacred. He did not escape death. The state and its murderous ways caught up to him in the end. And in fact, Jesus did not run from it, but turned to it and embraced it. And so maybe I'm getting off the path here, but the point is that I'm trying to put into some context this sense of the furnace of fire where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. That what I believe is that we'll all be purified, and that fire comes now or later. And Jesus invites us into that fire now, so that the later is not so painful, but is light. What is it that on Man and Meaning, what is it, Viktor Frankl, he says, what is to give light must endure burning. So yeah, that's how I understand those verses. All right, so finally, so Jesus has kind of finished with his parables about the kingdom of heaven in those 5. And now in verse 51, there's another parable that stands alone. So let's read it. Have you understood all of this? Jesus is asking the crowds he's teaching. And they say, yes. And Jesus, takes that answer at face value. So he says to them, therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like. All right, so before he was saying the kingdom of heaven is like yeast, mustard seed, etc. Now he's saying every teacher who's been trained for the kingdom of heaven, every scribe who is just a person who is a steward of the scriptures. So every steward of the scriptures who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. So the parable now is specifically about you crowd who I have taught, and you who have understood my teaching. This is who you are. You're a master of a household, bringing out of your treasure both what is new and what is old. That's an invitation for all of us to, I think, see ourselves, see that we have something to offer. I mean, that's just, let's put it just as simply as I think I can, is you've heard these parables, now go live them and teach them. That's kind of what Jesus is saying in this final parable. There is a mastery that Jesus is talking about. A master of a household, someone who owns their home, their household. To see yourself like that. He's talking to a lot of people who probably are not masters in a lot of ways in the world as it is. But in their own sense of their soul and in the community that they are creating within their own, starting in their own households and then their own neighborhoods and communities. There is value, great value, things to share, both what is new and what is old. Now, I think there's probably more to say about that parable. I feel like I remember hearing something about, it's sort of like a yard sale. And in fact, what Jesus is talking about is what not what you have to offer to others so much as what you let go of, what you get rid of. Not all of the treasure in our soul or in our nation is worth holding on to. Some of the new and some of the old have got to go. So that may indeed be what Jesus is saying. But he is certainly empowering the people who have heard and understood his parables to be those who are now the ones who can decide for themselves what teaching is good and bad, what structures are worth holding on to and worth letting go of, the systems and institutions that collective change peace. So there's this teaching is apparently all we need to be discerning in that way, both in our own souls and in the world around us, the collective. All right, there was a lot. I hope this is a blessing to you, and we talk to you later. I hope the same wisdom that is here, that you have heard it and understood it in the same way the crowd did.